Hey everyone, I'm so excited to share our podcast has been nominated in Boise Weekly's annual Best of Boise contest. And while it's an honor to be nominated, I have to admit, it would be even more fun to win. If we've helped you connect to the city you love, go to the link in the show notes to vote for us by May 23rd. Thanks, Boise.
Today on CityCast Boise, Mayor Lauren McLean just announced a new fund to build more permanent housing for our homeless community. But there's a nearby city that's taking a different approach to this problem. We're resharing our chat with Idaho Statesman reporter Rachel Spacek, who has details on how Reno got 500 people off their streets and what we might be able to learn from this strategy. It's Monday, May 20th. I'm Frankie Barnhill in for Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Rachel, good to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Rachel, you did this great story recently in the Idaho Statesman, which is why you're having you on today. You've been doing a bunch of reporting about Boise's housing situation and how to get unhoused people off the streets in particular. Tell me about this most recent story you did, though, where you compared us to a city in our region and their very different approach to homelessness and how it compares to Boise.
Yeah, so there was a story in the Wall Street Journal a little while ago about Reno, Nevada, and their approach and their model to getting unhoused people off the streets. It sounds like, based on what I've read from local journalists in the area, that it kind of all came to a head during the pandemic. There was just one typical standard shelter in Reno and lots of unhoused people. And so the city, in partnership with the county that they are in, used federal COVID emergency funds to basically build this 600-bed tent, so like a giant tent shelter, and also independent sleeping pods. So, for people who don't want to live in a standard homeless shelter, they have these independent sleeping pods where people can basically live independently but use sinks and other things that the county and city provide.
Okay, so I've never been to Reno. I think you have, but tell me about the demographics of Boise and Reno. Do you feel like this is a good comp that the Wall Street Journal compared these two cities, and then you of course did a story because you feel like the demographics are similar, the size of the cities are similar, but are the unhoused populations also similar?
Yeah, so I actually went to college in Reno, so I do have a bit of on-the-ground experience. And even going to school there just a few years ago, the city was dealing with a kind of a large unhoused population. I think it was back then similar to what Boise is dealing with now, not a huge population that it feels unmanageable at that point, but it's starting to be visible, and there are definitely people living on the streets. But based on a point in time count, which every year, once a year, around this time of year, volunteers go out and try to count homeless people, and it's often lower than the actual amount of homeless people. But in 2022, Reno had 780 unhoused people, and Ada County had 687. So there's about 100 people difference, but I think it is safe to compare just based on the city and kind of the region. So that's why I thought it was interesting to compare. And overall population, Reno is about 269,000 and Boise is about 237,000, 240,000. So similar cities, and it's kind of a comparable city.
Yeah. Recent housing boom and all of that stuff. People moving to these cities, these kind of mid-sized cities in the West. Mm-hmm. Okay, independent sleeping pods. Can you go into that a little more? Like, just like this sounds so fascinating.
Yeah, so it's a tiny home and no roommates. Like you just kind of live on your own. It's basically like a bed, a little bit of your own space, and they're kind of like independent. So yeah, they look like when you look at them, they look like tiny homes or even like trailers. But it's really good for people who have previous trauma or are even new to homelessness that don't feel comfortable in a large 600 bed shelter. You know, it's really good for them because they are safe and secure. And also, they have resources like sinks and that kind of stuff. So it sounds like it's really useful to people. And in my story, I cited a anecdote about someone who is living in one of those independent pods. This man said that he couldn't stay in a group shelter because he's immunocompromised, and so this safe camp is kind of where the independent sleeping pods are, and it's a private space, but he can still, be safe and out of the weather.
So just to be clear, Reno's doing both these sleeping pods, these independent homes, essentially for folks in combination with a more congregant sleeping area as well. So it's not like everybody's getting one of these independent pods. Yeah. Okay. I mean, this sounds kind of promising or effective. How effective has it been for Reno?
Yeah, so that was kind of the reason for the Wall Street Journal story. It was basically that this model has proved successful. For Reno, it's gotten 500 homeless people off the street since 2021. So
wow,
that's a lot of people. Yeah. And so far, I think it sounds like they had some hurdles in the beginning with just kind of implementing the model. I think they had lower staffing than they had ultimately needed and some issues with the bathroom not being at capacity. But it sounds like those have all been solved and they are continuing to try to get people off the streets and into either the tents or the sleeping pods.
Okay, so you saw this article in the Wall Street Journal. You were interested in finding out more about what Reno was doing, but then also whether Boise officials might be interested in emulating Reno. When you posed that question to officials at the city, what did they say? It sounds like they're not interested in pursuing this kind of model.
Yeah, I'm reading national news all the time or other local news and thinking, especially when it's based on housing, I'm thinking about how I can bring that to Boise and make that a statesman story. And so I know that the city of Boise is really being thoughtful in recent years, maybe since Lauren McLean became mayor, of trying to address the unhoused population and affordable housing. And so I thought that would be an interesting question to see if the city of Boise is thinking about this kind of model. And basically they said no. Short answer. They were worried about the expenses, and they say that whatever the city would put in financially to large shelter like this would take away from what they're really focused on, which is permanent housing, permanent affordable housing. And so that's kind of where the models that Reno is doing and that Boise is thinking about doing differ. Boise is really thinking about how do we get people not necessarily into shelters, but into homes that they can live in and eventually live independently in. So that's basically what the city told me is they are supportive of the shelter services we have here, which is the Interfaith Sanctuary, obviously, Boise Rescue Mission, and Catch, which, kind of points people to resources that they may need. So the city is supportive of them, but they are not necessarily thinking about themselves funding an additional shelter or something like that.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, of course, when any city finds any glimmer of hope in the very dark corners, which is homelessness in America, like it's understandable that other cities are interested in at least looking into what they're doing, seeing if it can apply at all to a particular city's situation. And It does seem like, I mean, to be fair, I suppose in Reno, this model's pretty new. So it's not as though there's, a 20-year track record to know, are these folks, these 500 folks who've been off the street because of this, are they going to long-term be off the street? Is this a short-term fix? But on the other hand, I think it's interesting that city officials, at least so far, are saying no to something like this that at least seems to be giving relief to folks who are experiencing homelessness today, in Reno.
Yeah, and in the statement that the city provided me, communications manager provided me, she was a little bit critical of the Reno model. She said this particular type of shelter encampment is expensive, does not always provide plumbing, electricity, and has mixed results regarding effectiveness. So I think valid concerns, but if you do the research on what's happening in Reno, they did maybe have some of these problems originally, but it seems like at least now, like you mentioned, we don't have a ton of years of data to look at, but it seems like they've overcome these challenges and their model has taken 500 people off the streets and into shelter.
One size fits all seemed like a good idea for clothes.
Nice dress. It's a t-shirt.
Until you tried it on. Same goes for your healthcare. That's why United Healthcare offers a variety of flexible, budget-friendly coverage for medical, vision, dental, and more. So whether you're between jobs, coming off a parent's plan, or even missed open enrollment, you can find the plan that fits you best. Find out more about United Healthcare coverage at uh1.com. That's uh1.com.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. You might say all kinds of stuff when things go wrong, but these are the words you really need to remember. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. They've got options to fit your unique insurance needs, meaning you can talk to your agent to choose the coverage you need. Have coverage options to protect the things you value most. File a claim right on the State Farm mobile app and even reach a real person when you need to talk to someone. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Boise's housing first approach, it's obviously something, as you mentioned, Mayor Lauren McLean has championed, and now she's in her second term. It seems like voters, or at least are, because of the fact that they voted her in for a second term, at least generally approve of that idea. Is it effective?
Yeah, so the city really, I think in the last year has really buckled down on trying to focus on building low-income permanent homes. And their goal is to fund almost a little bit over 1,000 of these homes. And the ways that they're doing this is kind of interesting. They're donating land to developers to try to get the costs down and therefore translate that into keeping rents low. So they're trying to be thoughtful, and they want to expand some of the permanent supportive housing that we do have at New Path and Ballard Point. And for people who don't know, they are apartments for homeless people, and then they also include resources like healthcare and counseling to specifically chronically homeless people. And those two supportive housing apartments that we have now, I've heard they're at capacity. People aren't necessarily leaving them and getting into additional or housing, the next step of housing. So the city really wants to boost that. The city is also really focused on, I think they call it affordable housing, which is dedicated to people earning 60% or below area median income, which I've done another story on this. That is, really good for your teachers or, nurses or people who are making consistent income but can't necessarily afford the high rents that we're seeing in Boise. So that's really useful for them, but it's not necessarily useful for a person making 30% or below area median income, which, they can afford $500 or $600 maximum of rent.
Yeah. Yeah. So it seems like there's this gap between these two segments of the population and the housing that's available to them in Boise today.
Yeah, definitely. And I talked to Jody Peterson for a different story. She runs Interfaith Sanctuary, about if these, quote, affordable housing options that the city is pushing, if these will help people who are, living right now in Interfaith Sanctuary, who could make anywhere from $0 to, a couple thousand. And she kind of said no, and there is, in fact, this gap. And it was really interesting talking to her. She pitched an idea that I can't help but draw similarities to this Reno model of more of a communal living or a dorm style housing for people who might be in shelters or struggling with homelessness right now, so they can have a roof over their head, but it isn't, an independent living situation where they have to pay $1,000 in rent. So yeah, there's definitely seems to be a discrepancy between what the city deems as affordable and then what homeless people can actually afford eventually.
Rachel, thank you so much for keeping your eye on this really important story and for doing all this reporting and for coming on to tell us about it.
Thank you. Always happy to talk about it.
Okay, that's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you like the show, you should subscribe to our Hey Boise newsletter. Every weekday, it comes out with a mix of local news and events you need to know. We'll be back tomorrow morning with a breakdown of the best and worst roads to bike on around the city. See you then.